A good day to you. I hope that you all are doing well, staying healthy, and keeping all those rules that they want us to follow. I'm getting a little stir crazy, even though I do get outside some. It's just not right not being with you folks. But that's the way it's got to be. Today's lecture is going to be on as I say here on the screen, on the Jesus Scholarship in the 1980s, but really mostly on the Jesus Seminar. And what I'm going to do here is nothing incredibly profound, because the readings have done a good job of bringing you the information I want you to have. So all I'm going to do is pretty much be highlighting some sections of the different readings, and maybe I will have cleared up something that was a little confusing for you. I'm going to start with the first 16 pages of Robert Funk's The Five Gospels, and then we'll move into some other materials in just a second. A quick word about Robert Funk. I believe it's in Powell, but Funk was a incredibly powerful, influential New Testament scholar. His work I believe in text criticism is also pretty deep as well. It has a long-standing reputation, but also a reputation for being rather controversial in some of his observations. And certainly, if you've read the material, which I pray that you have, on the Jesus Seminar, then you know why indeed, some of this work would have been very controversial. But we'll be getting to that. All right, I'm going to jump down to page 2 in the introductory material, and note just a few names here that he brings to our attention. Of course, there's Herman Samuel Reimarus, who is kind of seen as kind of the initiator of the quest for the historical Jesus, at least since the Enlightenment. The subtitle for Albert Schweitzer's book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, is From Reimarus to Wrede, and that's W-R-E-D-E. So you also saw it as the beginning of the quest itself. I've forgotten about Thomas Jefferson trying to separate the real teachings of Jesus from Christian doctrine. I completely forgotten that, and that's not something I've had a chance to research at all. But Funk says it's true. That's most likely that's going to be the case, at least in this instance. There'll be some other things that we may want to question him on. On page 3 here, he talks about David Friedrich Strauss, who also played a very critical role in the development of the quest for the historical Jesus, and his Life of Jesus Critically Examined is just one of the classics. Notice we're talking here about 1835, so this is very close to the beginnings of the Enlightenment, and to me it doesn't seem that long ago. I'm not that old, but it's amazing to me that so much ground has been covered within the 2 centuries, slightly less than 2 centuries. He was the first to make this distinction between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. And this will become a classic distinction. This is a phrase or a contrast I'd really like you to remember, that you would remember this 5 years from now, because the quest for the historical Jesus really was an attempt to try to see the relationship between those two things. Now, there are some scholars who and many, as you notice from the Jesus Seminar, who prefer to think of separating the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. And if you remember the weakness in the criterion of dissimilarity, then you'll hear a little bit of those echoes in the background for that. If they want to separate the two, there's an assumption that there is very little correlation between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history, which I believe that we all agreed was probably a specious type of assertion. That doesn't mean the criterion of dissimilarity has no applicability at all, and it's not useful. It's just we don't want to go too wild and crazy with it. Anyway, as they tell us, when we move through after Schweitzer, this is about the second to last paragraph on page 3, that the neo-orthodoxy, the people like Barth and Bultmann and such, they really did not have much interest in the historical Jesus. Bultmann did a lot of analysis of the New Testament, but he wasn't inquiring as to what we could recover about Jesus historically. Of course, Bultmann was also an existentialist Christian theologian, and existentialism has very little interest in the Jesus of history. It's because from an existentialist Christology focuses on the meaning of Jesus in my situation today. So the historical Jesus is pretty much irrelevant to that. On page 4, the Funk has us note how there was a movement of biblical scholarship out of the churches and seminaries in many ways into the universities and independent colleges. In some ways, this was of necessity because there's still an awful, as he notes very well here, there was an awful lot of persecution of scholars who employed the historical analytical approach to the study of the New Testament, and also, of course, in the quest for the historical Jesus. And so, in a sense, the church kind of pushed out a lot of this scholarship. That doesn't mean that there was still not a lot of good critical scholarship going on within seminaries and church-related institutions. It's just an awful lot of it had to be pushed out, or was pushed out. And one of the interesting things here that if you know Bart Ehrman at all, you might have begun to notice in the beginning of page, or in the middle of page 4, is that Funk said that as the quest for the historical Jesus moved out of the seminaries and church-related institutions, that the Jesus of history was being liberated from an eschatological Jesus. Now, the reason I mention Ehrman is he, as you might recall, believes that Jesus was a thoroughgoing apocalypticist. And this is one of the things I have my students in my New Testament introduction wrestle with. But anyway, according to Funk, the notion that Jesus, the historical Jesus, was eschatologically oriented, at least in an apocalyptic sense, it was passé. It's water under the bridge. Well, not so to Ehrman. We get a good sample of the very rigorous, and I won't deny right now, to go ahead and say it, I think overly rigorous application of the various historical critical tools by Funk and company. If you look to the third paragraph from the bottom on page 4, the one that begins with Jesus's followers, about 5 lines from the bottom, he says that the Jesus of the Gospels is an imaginative theological construct into which has been woven traces of that enigmatic sage from Nazareth, traces that cry out for recognition and liberation from the firm grip of those whose faith overpowered their memories. End quote. That's a pretty rigorous type of statement to make, but it does show, and maybe you picked it up by 4 pages by then, the frustration that Funk and many of the members of the Jesus Seminar felt with frankly, the persecution that they were receiving as they were trying to engage in historical analysis. And I mean, I can just give you a little bit of a personal experience on this. It wasn't that many years ago where I learned from students at Catawba that their parents told them not to take any of my courses in biblical studies because I was the tool of the devil. And they were actually representing a very common notion that the scholarly approach to understanding Jesus or the New Testament was evil. And so back to Funk and company, many of their remarks are overly rigorous and harsh and such, but you got to put this in a historical context if you don't mind the irony on this, and note that indeed they're speaking out of a lot of frustration and pain, actually. Now, something else that he notes at the bottom page of 4 was this something we're going to talk about later, and I think Powell does a good job of evaluating this for us, so I'm going to hold on to it later. But Funk and the seminar believe that we need to recover the the oral traditions connected with Jesus, because they thought that these are more authentic. Of course, what those oral traditions were, we'll have to talk about that a little bit later on. Onto page 5. I'm paraphrasing him here, where I say the Jesus Seminar has assumed the burden of proof for recovering the historical Jesus from the mythic narratives of the New Testament, end quote, and paraphrase, I should say. He thinks it's kind of ironic that the seminar is taking up the. Actually, I think it's ironic, but anyway, that he says that the seminar is taking up the banner for the historical Jesus, that the burden of proof, he believes, needs to be upon people like the seminar to prove the historical elements of Jesus. That prior to the Enlightenment, certainly prior to the Jesus Seminar, the basic belief in the church was that the historians had to prove that the Bible was wrong. And this Jesus Seminar said, we've really got that bass backwards, that it's really incumbent upon the those who are interpreting the New Testament to prove the historicity or the historical authenticity of claims about Jesus in the New Testament, especially in light of the heavily Christological orientations of all 4 Gospels. Okay. Anyway, let's move now into this next section on the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith on page 5. He begins talking in here about some of the different discoveries that they had. For example, that some 82% of the words ascribed to Jesus in the gospel were not his and such. But he doesn't have to bring that in yet, but he did. And let's turn over to page 6, where he really gets to the substance of this section. And in here he's duking it out with inerrantists. And inerrancy has a very technical definition among New Testament scholars. We need to be all on the same page with this. Somebody who holds an inerrant position believes that the words of the Bible are literally the words of God in their original form. Now they don't start mincing words as far as to the different textual traditions. They ignore, frankly, the textual differences that we have from text analysis. All those differences, like we see at the end of Mark's Gospel, for example. But the basic inerrantist position is that those are verbatim God's words, pretty much. And of course, most of them hold that verbatim as represented in the King James Version, which I say this with respect, but all accuracy too is really pretty silly, because of the problems that we have with the texts that were used by the authors of the King James Version, which I still love. The poetic expression in there is beautiful, and it's remarkable to me that that the scholars from 1611 were able to come up with the translations they did, which most of them have turned out to be pretty good. But there are some places where we've got some serious issues. Anyway, on page 6, Funk reminds us that historical analysis deals not with the question of inerrancy, or does not presuppose any theological claims, but rather deals with, as he says in the second paragraph, historical probability. And you've heard this from me before, that all historical claims are claims of probability, greater or lesser probability. But you and I operate on that kind of truth system regularly. And historical claims are never absolutely certain. Most of the truth claims we make in our lives are not absolutely certain. But historical ones saying that given the evidence, we say it's most probable that something happened, or it's most probable that something didn't happen. So anyway, one last point he makes. I want to do this in 30 seconds. I think it's good. It's the second last paragraph on page 6 in the major section. He says that inerrancy fails because because for it to really work, the people interpreting the Bible would have to be inerrant in their interpretations. And that's a point I'd never thought of before, because we are flawed vessels. And yet some people claim that they know absolutely what the Scripture says, And that means, of course, that their interpretation is absolutely God's word. And that gets a little dangerous. All right, we need to stop this lecture, move on to part 2 in a second.